If you're wondering where to start with philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, then you probably already have some idea, at least, of who he was and what his works might be about. In fact, even if you've never read anything that he wrote, there's a very good chance that you have encountered Nietzsche before, at least somewhere. And that's because Nietzsche has been enormously influential on much of modern thought, as well as a lot of popular culture in the last century or so. His ideas have made their way into films and TV shows, fiction, music, and of course there's no shortage of articles and videos on the internet with titles like What Nietzsche Really Meant by This or That, or How Reading Nietzsche Can Make You More Emotionally Resilient, or something along those lines. All of this, therefore, can make it very hard for new readers of Friedrich Nietzsche to have a true first experience with his work, an experience that is unclouded by preconceived notions and outside opinions of other people. Therefore, in thinking about where to start with Friedrich Nietzsche, I've come to believe that the best place to begin is not with Nietzsche at all. Instead, I've come to think that the best place to start with Nietzsche is to start with yourself. To start by asking what you already know, or think you know, about Nietzsche, and about some of the topics that he addresses in his writings. What I'm hoping that we can do together in this talk is work through a kind of meditation, I suppose. Perhaps an untimely meditation, as Nietzsche would say. Now, you don't have to close your eyes or anything. I'm just going to give you a few questions to perhaps think about before beginning to talk about Nietzsche's work itself. The first thing I would suggest is to think back to the first time you heard about Friedrich Nietzsche. Did someone recommend one of his books to you, maybe a friend or a professor? Did you hear his name referenced in a film or television show? Maybe you've read other philosophers who have cited Nietzsche in their own work. Think back to whoever or whatever it was that first introduced you to Nietzsche, and ask yourself what it was that piqued your interest about him. Or at least, what was it about the way he was presented that interested you? For example, did a friend tell you that Nietzsche is like the greatest philosopher of all time and you simply must read him? Did your youth pastor tell you that Nietzsche is responsible for justifying all kinds of very bad behavior? Maybe someone on YouTube has blended Nietzschean philosophy with Sigma male grindset quotes and thumping club music in the background. However you first heard about Nietzsche, the point is there's almost certainly going to be some kind of context in which his ideas and work were presented. And before you have your own experience with his work, it can be beneficial to take stock of any preconceived notions or expectations that you might have going into it. For me, it was a friend in high school who first introduced me to Friedrich Nietzsche. There was a guy in one of my classes who was always carrying around different philosophy books with authors with very hard to pronounce names that I'd never heard of since I'd never read any philosophy before. He was finally able to convince me to read one of these books, and it happened to be this one, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, one of Friedrich Nietzsche's most well-known works. And not only was this the first book of Nietzsche's that I read, this was also my introduction to philosophy overall. The reason we're starting off by thinking about the context in which we first encountered Friedrich Nietzsche is because we're kind of putting ourselves in the shoes of the philosophers who really first discovered him and popularized his ideas in the early 20th century. At the start, I said that Nietzsche is very influential. Nowadays, at least in philosophy departments, Nietzsche is kind of like a household name, but that has not always been the case. During Nietzsche's own lifetime, he was virtually unheard of, and it was not until a number of years after his death that his work began to be widely read and taken seriously. So, in a way, Nietzsche is a philosopher who was discovered, and you're now discovering his work for the first time. And your position is really not that different from these early 20th century European philosophers such as Jaspers, Heidegger, and Husserl, and then later Sartre and Camus, who then popularized Nietzsche's work. Because these philosophers themselves were reading Nietzsche within a particular context and using his work to react to particular issues that were prescient at their time. Namely, the paranoia over the apparent loss of any meaning or value in the world following the Second World War. By thinking about what context you're in today, when you're first discovering Nietzsche's work, you're setting yourself up to discover his work in a particular way which makes it meaningful to you. For me, discovering Nietzsche in my late teens was very timely, because that's a period when a lot of people go through many changes in the way that they think about the world and in what they value. Which brings me to my next question to ponder. What is it that you value? What do you consider to be good, and what do you consider to be evil? Why do you do the things that you consider good? Do you do them purely because they're good? Do you do them because you're hoping to get something out of it? Or do you reject entirely the notion of good and evil? Which, if you do, then you're kind of already on the same page as Nietzsche, because he does as well. One of the most salient lines of thought in Nietzsche's writing is precisely this, that what we consider good or evil is really only because we've been told as such. There's nothing actually good or evil about anything. These are just human constructs that we've created or that we've accepted without much thought, because that's what our parents did, that's what our society values, and so on. This next question might surprise you because it's based in the idea that one of the things Nietzsche is very critical of is philosophy itself. A philosopher criticizing philosophy, who would think of such a thing? More broadly speaking, Nietzsche is critical of the idea that reason is something which we can always rely on to save us from all kinds of problems. Actually, he thinks reason is one of the causes of many of the problems that we have. Or more specifically, our over-reliance on reason is the cause of many problems that we've got going on for us. What do you think? Do you think that reason and critical thinking are exactly what the world needs more of? Do you think that most of the problems in society can be solved if we just think them through rationally? Do you think philosophy and science will save us? Or do you think that there are limits to what reason can do? Do you think there are limits to philosophy, science, and so on? This is, I would say, kind of one of the subtle points of Nietzsche's philosophy. It certainly runs through much of his work, but it's not as apparent and maybe not as talked about. I know for myself, when I first was reading Nietzsche, like I said, he was the first philosopher I ever read, so I didn't really have much of an opinion, one way or the other. I suppose I assumed that critical thinking and reason were good, at maybe the best ways to solve problems. But if you asked me why I thought that, ironically, I'm not sure I would have been able to actually give you a reasonable answer. Now that I've been studying philosophy more rigorously over the last several years, studying it in college, I gotta say, I'm actually, I think, more acquainted with the limits of what philosophy can do than I've ever been. I think when I was younger, I looked at philosophy as kind of a way to replace some of the older ways of thinking that I'd been relying on up till that point in my life. I'm not sure that's the correct attitude to have. To some extent, maybe it's unavoidable, especially when you're that young, being exposed to these ideas, to kind of romanticize them. But now as I've gotten a little older, hopefully a little wiser, I've also gotten a little humbler with respect to how I view philosophy. Even though I study philosophy and I'm thinking about it all the time, I no longer look at it as the solution to all the world's problems. Of course, we saved the biggest question for last. What do you think of God? Do you believe in God? If so, do you have any particular reason why? Is it something you've never thought about before? It's just something you do? Maybe your family does it, or your society approves of it or encourages it. If you don't believe in God, again, do you have any particular reasons why you don't believe in God? Has that always been the case for you? Did you believe at one point and somewhere along the road rejected this idea? What happened for you? What changed? But the most important thing to think about, I believe, is what are the implications of believing in God? Not just for you, but if you can conceive of it, what do you think the implications are for everyone else? For example, what do you think would happen if everyone stopped believing in God? If everyone became an atheist? Do you think that that would be party time? Or do you think that would cause everyone to sink into unbearable despair and despondency? Do you think that the eradication of religion is something that we should strive for, as the new atheist movement of the 90s and early 2000s really pushed for? Not sure how successful they were. Or do you think that there is some kind of role that religion serves for people, whether you believe in God or not, that you think is important to preserve in some way? The reason we're talking about God is because Nietzsche himself was an atheist. He was very critical of religion, and these are things which he wrote quite a lot about. But what makes his critique of religion interesting is that Nietzsche was very concerned with what might happen if everyone lost their belief in God, coupled with the fact that he also happened to think this was inevitable, or that it had already happened, as expressed in his famous quote, "God is dead." What he means is that people have en masse lost the belief in a supernatural being, God. And as such, they have lost touch with anything that can be conceived of as absolute, universal, or reliable, including morality. Now, you might be thinking, well, if Nietzsche is critical of religion, and we've said he's critical of the idea of morality, doesn't he think that people losing their faith in these things is positive? Ideally, yes. But in practice, Nietzsche doesn't think that people will be able to handle it. He doesn't think people will be able to simply get rid of God, get rid of religion, and get rid of morals without almost immediately afterwards replacing them with something probably much worse. One of the things he was most concerned about was that people would fall into nihilism. And depending on what you've heard about Nietzsche, that statement may surprise you. Nietzsche is very often described as a nihilist. And in my opinion, for whatever it's worth, this is one of the most egregious misstatements about any philosopher, maybe like ever. It's just one of my biggest pet peeves, because Nietzsche was not a nihilist. I mean, he was a nihilist with respect to morals, but he was not a nihilist in the sense that most people employ that term. When most people use the word nihilist, they mean someone who has given up on life and is basically just maybe living for pleasure or doesn't see the point in living. That's not Nietzsche at all. For one thing, a true nihilist, would not live the way Nietzsche lived. Nietzsche wrote scores of texts that were virtually unheard of while he was alive. And yet he kept doing it. And if you read his books, especially if you read like his introductions and prefaces, you'll notice that he is very aware that the ideas he's coming up with are fairly significant. But he's also aware that his ideas are kind of ahead of their time, which kind of sucks, doesn't it? I mean, can you imagine knowing that your ideas are ahead of your own time? That's really sad. He still kept at it. He kept writing for years, even though he didn't enjoy much success at all. And as it turns out, he was right. His ideas were ahead of his time. And unfortunately, it wasn't until a long time after he'd already died that people started to realize that and started to take his work seriously. That's not something a nihilist does, at least as far as I'm concerned. That's something that someone does who is invested in something bigger than themselves. Maybe not something supernatural, but Nietzsche frequently addresses his books to what he calls free spirits and future generations. So he was writing for a future audience. He was writing for you and me, even though he'd never met us. Is that something that someone who's given up on life does? You know, doing all this work, presumably for the benefit of people they'll never meet? I don't know about that. In philosophy, nihilism literally means no something. For example, an ontological nihilist, which is a position you can hold in metaphysics, means that you don't believe that anything exists. You don't believe in any objects. It's kind of a weird one. Existential nihilism is the belief that there is no objective meaning to life. Nietzsche is certainly an existential nihilist. He is certainly a nihilist with respect to morality. No objective meaning to life kind of follows that there's no objective morals, no right and wrong. But he's not a nihilist with respect to whether or not he infuses his own life with meaning. And that is exactly what Nietzsche is worried that people will do. He is worried that people who lose their belief in God, lose their belief in good and evil, will fall into despair, when instead, what Nietzsche says, you should create your own values, create your own ideas, your own goals that are bigger than yourselves, kind of like he did. Now that our untimely meditation has concluded, I wanted to give you some kind of just practical tips, if I may, on starting with Friedrich Nietzsche. First of all, do I have any specific books that I would recommend you start with? I would say 2. For myself, I began with Zarathustra, and I would definitely recommend that to anyone as their introduction to Nietzsche's work. However, Zarathustra is written in a style that is probably unlike any other philosophy book that you'll ever read. It's written more like a gospel or a parable, rather than an essay with, supporting premises, conclusions, and so on. If you're looking for something with a little more structure, you might want to check out On the Genealogy of Morals. That's where Nietzsche lays out his argument for why we should accept the claim that morals are not objective, that they're just human constructs. That's where he kind of shows us, or attempts to show us, how we got our ideas of good and evil in the first place. Besides specific texts of Nietzsche, there's also a lot of really good anthologies and collected works of Friedrich Nietzsche's writings. This is the most recent book that I've purchased by Nietzsche. I bought this probably 5 or 6 years ago. It's called Basic Writings of Nietzsche. It's got an introduction by Peter Gay, and it's translated and edited by Walter Kaufmann. That's another tip I would give you. If you ever see a book by Nietzsche that has the name Walter Kaufmann somewhere on it, definitely take a look at that book, because Walter Kaufmann is one of the preeminent, most well-known translators and editors of Nietzsche's work. I would also suggest that anytime you pick up a book of Nietzsche's, to try and get one that's got some kind of introduction from the editor or translator, whoever that might be. Like I said, Kaufmann is pretty well known, but if you get a copy of one of Nietzsche's books that has an introduction from someone else, definitely read that. Don't skip that over, because Nietzsche is a very difficult philosopher to follow. He's very fun. Some people might say he's one of the most fun philosophers to read, and I can totally see why people would feel that way. He can definitely make philosophy interesting, but he's also very hard to follow. it's not always clear when he's actually making a clear argument and when he's just pissed off about something and ranting. Sometimes it's a little bit of both. That's why introductions from translators and editors can give context and explanations that Nietzsche himself will probably, you won't find in his actual writings. And that can be very helpful. The good thing about this particular anthology is it's complete text. It's 5 complete books by Nietzsche. That's kind of hard to find. It doesn't have Zarathustra in it, but it does have Genealogy of Morals. It's got Beyond Good and Evil. It's also got his first book ever, The Birth of Tragedy. And it's got his last book, Ecce Homo, which is like his intellectual autobiography. The last thing I would say is that Nietzsche's philosophy begins at the end. His philosophy becomes meaningful to people precisely at moments where they start to question why they believe what they do, why they value what they do. And whatever you end up coming away with from Nietzsche's work, whether he convinces you of something, affirms or validates something for you, or whether you come away thinking, how did this guy get so famous? His writing is terrible. Whatever your takeaway is from Nietzsche, whatever your experience ends up being, my hope is that by thinking through some of these questions and focusing on the context you're finding yourself in when you're discovering his work for the first time, that your experience will be as close to a true first encounter as possible. Hopefully that will make it enjoyable for you to read this undeniably brilliant writer. I want to thank Osama X. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. Sorry. They were the viewer who suggested that I do a talk on where to start with Nietzsche. I'm really glad that they did because it gave me an opportunity to revisit someone's work who I haven't really spent much time with over the last few years or so. And I've been really enjoying thinking about some of these things. I hope that it's been interesting or helpful for you as well. And let me know in the comments below if there's something you think I left out that you'd like more information on. Hopefully I can help you with that. Happy reading and take care.